Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin daf Vav. Today's daf is sponsored by Emma Rimberg in loving memory of her father, Dr. Eric Glick, Yitzchak Nisan ben Yaakov, who passed away 36 years ago. Missed by me every day, he would be so proud to see his descendants living in Israel and living a full Jewish life. Today's daf is sponsored by Malka Sima Abraham in loving memory of her father, Chaim Ben Moshe, Zichrono Livracha, in his fourth yahrzeit. He was always very proud of my accomplishments and encouraged me to continue progressing. May his memory be a blessing. Today's daf is sponsored by Ari Goldman and Shira Dicker in honor of the birthday of their daughter Emma Goldman, who turned 38 yesterday. Salto. Okay, we're going to learn today about the treifot of an oaf, of a bird. Okay, so we're going to basically have the two parallel mishnayot that we have by the animals, we're now going to have by the birds. But instead of the first mishnah taking 10 dapim, the first mishnah will take less than a complete daf. So it'll be a little simpler. And we're only going to have a few topics we're going to delve into within each one because some of them are pretty basically similar to what we saw before. Okay, starting with our Mishnah on the third line of today's daf. Elu treifot ba'of. So here are the treifas in an oaf, in a bird. Nikuvat haveshet upsukata gargeret. That's exactly the same, where the gullet has any sort of perforation, and the gargeret, the windpipe, is cut, right? Is like cut majority of it. Hikata chulda al rosha mekom she'oseh ota treifa. Okay, if a chulda, and I'm specifically not translating it, and I'll explain why in a minute. If a chulda came and it pecked it on the head, okay, we're going to see later they mean with its teeth, like cut into the head with its teeth, in a place where it makes it a treifa. Okay, why didn't I translate chulda? Last time we translated it, thanks to Ruth's help, as a weasel. But if you read Chullin Mishkan's article this week in Flashback, you'll see that there's a bit of a deliberation whether it's a weasel or whether it's a rat, which kind of rat, and whole interesting discussion about what this chulda is, based on all sorts of sugyot in the Gemara where chuldas appear, and she even talks a little bit at the end of the article about Chulda the prophetess and why she's called Chulda. It's a pretty awful name. And then she points out even the Devora and Chulda, right? Devora is also a bee. Okay, or a hornet. Thank you. So a hornet, and it's a little bit of a strange name for prophetesses. Anyway, so you can read the article and read more about it. So some sort of little creature, either a weasel or a rat, bites this bird on the top of its head and makes it into a treifa. Nikev. Okay, so now we're going to see. In a location, what does this mean? And this is going to be the whole first Amud Aleph is all about this. In a place where it makes it a treifa. What does that mean? It means in the brain. Okay, right? Pecked it on the head or bit it on the head. And basically, we're going to say that we're assuming that it made a hole, that it bit through, right? Not just the skull, but the krum hamoach, the membrane of the brain. This is why this matches up to the previous Mishnah we had. Right? Nikuvada veshep sukara gargeret, and then nikev krom shamach. So this is the way that nikev krom shamach of a bird. Now we're going to see though that there's a way to check this, and that's going to be the whole topic of the Gemara. How do you check if really there was a tear in the brain membrane? Okay, it's not clear necessarily. So this would already be a sign that it's likely a treifa, but we'd have to check further to see, or at least we can check further to see, is it really torn or not? And that's going to be a discussion in the Gemara how we do that. Nikev ha-korkevan. Okay, the korkevan, wow, I forgot to check all these words in English. Okay, let me just get my English and then that will help me. Okay, the gizzard, right? No, right, that's the gizzard. Let me just remember what the different parts are. Nikeva court, right, that's the gizzard. If the gizzard was perforated, okay, if you remember the way it works with a bird, first it goes through the crop, right, then I'm remembering my words, the zefek is the crop, then it goes to the gizzard. Now both these basically chew up the food, okay, the birds don't have their own teeth to chew it up, so it gets chewed up in these different parts before it gets to the inside, to the stomach area. So if there's a nekev, any sort of perforation in the korkevan, which is the second place it gets to after the crop, right, the gizzard, and nikvua dakin, and the intestines, any sort of perforation, there is a treifa. Nafla la'or, if it fell into a fire, v'nechmeru b'nei me'eha, and basically singe the inner parts of the body. Now we're going to see how do you check this. So the Mishnah is going to tell us, but we're going to see it's a little more than this. Im yirukim psulim, im adumim ksherim. If the inner parts of the body look green, then it's a disqualification because we assume the fire made them turn green. But if they're red, which is their natural color, then they're kshirin. Now, this is a little confusing because not every part in the body is red. Also, what do we mean by green? Sounds a little strange. We've talked about how green sometimes means yellow. Green could mean blue. Green could mean all different colors. However, the Rishonim mostly say that this really means green. So I don't know about body parts turning green, but I definitely don't know a lot about body parts of birds for sure, so I can't tell you. But they seem to have this assumption that the fire would affect it by making it turn green. Okay? But if they're red, which is its natural color, they're kshirim. We're going to see more about this later, so we'll put this aside for right now. Because we're going to see it's not as simple and clear-cut as the Mishnah says. Drasa utrafa bekotel. Okay, now we have osher ritzatzta behema. We have 3 types of traumatic experience that can happen to the bird, just like we had in the animal where it falls from a roof. So this is something that happens to a bird, that either a person tramples on it, or trafa bekotel, or it gets hit against a wall, or ritzatzta behema, an animal trotted upon it. Umefarkeset, if it's still moving, convulsing, okay, or twitching, vishahata me'ed la'ed, in other words, meaning twitching, showing sign of life, and you waited 24 hours, vishahata kshera, okay? And you slaughter it, it'll be kshera. Interesting, in the Mishnah of all the psulim, we're talking about a kshera, but the point is if it doesn't do that, it's a treifa. And that's why they're telling you this in this Mishnah. It actually is a good lead into the next Mishnah because it ends with, well, if it's like this, it'll be kshera, and then we're going to go on. Now, also the previous one said, if it turns green, it'll be a problem. If it turns red, it's kshera. So now, basically, we're going to assume there was trauma to the bird, but we have a way to check, which is wait 24 hours. If it's still functioning after 24 hours and gets up and walks around, although there's a bit of a, does it have to walk around, does it have to just stand up, but seems to be okay. But we're going to see that this isn't 100% the case. Okay, so the first thing, as I told you, we're going to deal with is a case where the skull is basically broken into because of the biting of this chulda, we'll call it weasel or rat. And now we want to check the krum shalmoach. Is it torn or not? Because we assume right now, the Mishnah sounded like you assume it's a problem. But already right away, in the first generation of Moraim, we have Rav, Ushmuel, Levi, that all of them, the Amrei, right, they often disagree, but they all say, Machnis yado lifnim ubodek. You put your finger in and check. Okay, where do you put your finger in? According to most of the commentaries, you put your finger in the mouth and kind of go upward. Kind of sounds a little disgusting. Put the finger in. This is obviously after the animal's dead. You put the finger in. You put it up. Push through the brain. Okay, you get to where the brain is. You push through it with your finger, and then you see what happens. Okay. Im mivatzbetz ve'ole treifa. If something comes out the other side where the hole in the skull is, then you know that the krum, the membrane, was torn. Because why else would it be coming out? V'im lav, if nothing comes out, kshera. So this is a way to check and see, maybe it wasn't really torn. Maybe they just bit through the skull and not the brain membrane. So it's a very simple test, I guess, right? Put your finger in, push it, and if nothing comes out, right, like a balloon, you know, completely sealed, you don't have to worry about it. Now, Hani chalamanda amar, wait, this only works if you hold diminkav kramatata'a. Sorry, ad diminkav kramatata'a. That is not enough. Remember the brain membrane, there's 2. There's the inner and the outer. That's only if we say it's not enough for the inner brain, for the outer membrane to be torn. You need also the inner membrane to be torn in order to make it a treifa. Well, then that makes perfect sense because then there's going to be a hole in both if it comes out, and that's going to prove there's a hole in both. But ela lamanda amar inkav afagav de lo inkav tata'a. But if you hold that if the top membrane, the outer one, is broken and the inner one is not torn at all, it's still a treifa. Well, then the inner membrane could still be intact and it'll still be a treifa. So this test isn't going to work. Nichush, we should be concerned. Dilma ila'a inkuf tata'a lo inkuf. Maybe the inner membrane is intact, but the outer one is broken. And if the outer one is broken, it's a problem. But this test isn't going to show anything because the inner membrane is intact, and therefore none of the brain nerve tissue inside is going to be coming out of that hole when we push on it. To which the Gemara says, no, of course it will. Now remember, the outer one is much thicker, and the inner one is much thinner. So if you start pushing your finger in there, poking it in, and the outer one is torn, Tata'a agav ruchachem mifkapaka. The inner one is going to basically tear based on you're going to push your finger in, and it's going to, basically that pressure is going to cause the inner membrane to tear. So even if only the outer membrane needs to be torn for it to make it a treifa, this test will work anyway. That's what the Gemara claims. Okay, now comes the Erev. So the first thing we have is Rav Shmuel and Levi saying, here's your test, put your finger in through there. By the way, the Rif has a different gear to that. You put your finger in through the hole in the skull. Okay, some people say that's weird, and maybe what he meant was also from below and also from above. Anyway, there's a whole different, because it never says where you put your finger in, but most people think it's through the mouth. Okay, now comes Ze'eri. Amar Ze'eri, ein b'dika l'chulda. There's no way to check, which means that if a weasel came, let's just call it a weasel right now, and tore through, then you have no way to check, which means, now why is that? We'll see in a minute. I don't want to read it because it's not clear yet, and the Gemara is going to have to explain it, so I just want to wait. But because there's no check, it means that if chulda came and attacked your bird, we're going to assume it's a treifa no matter what. Okay? There's no way to really check. Why? Because its teeth are small or something like that. So the Gemara says, I don't know, get it. What does that help? Oh, thin. Thank you. That's the word. They're thin. So what if they're thin? They're thin and angled. This, by the way, in Shulli's article is why she claims this isn't a weasel, and it's more likely a rat because their teeth are akumot. Okay, there's all different ways you can come up with theories as to what these are based on facts you have in the different Gemaras that talk about chuldas. Anyway, it could be also, by the way, in different places they talked about other ones. So now, because they angle in, let's say, what's going to happen is that when they bite, they're going to break through the skull in one place, but tear the membrane in another place. So because of that, what will happen? What will happen is, when you do this test, the liquid from the brain might not actually come out. Because even if it comes out, you might not see it because it won't come out the skull because the two holes are not opposite each other. It's going to tear through the skull in one place, tear through the brain membrane somewhere else. And now we're going to end up with a problem that you won't be able to test. So because you won't see the brain fluid coming out, you won't know whether there's a hole or not, and therefore you can't check. Kislik l'nehardia. Now, so first the Ari says basically there's no check for this. Then we have to figure out why there's no test. Okay, we got it. So he's going to basically say anytime a chulda attacks a bird near where the brain is, problem. But kislik l'nehardia, when he went up to Nehardia, shalach lehu, he sent to them dvarim, like he sends back to where he was originally. Dvarim she'amarti lifnechem ta'utem biyadi. Okay, great line. Right? What I sang you before was a complete mistake, right? We love people who get up and admit their mistakes, right? We're always seeing in these Gemaras these interactions with rabbis and showing you how to live your life, right? Get up and admit your mistake when you do it. What I said was a mistake. Biram kach. Okay, so now it sounds like he's saying you can totally test it. He says, but a little bit of limitation. Biram kach amru mishmei de Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. But I will tell you that in the name of Rish Lakish, they say, Bodkim l'chulda biyad, aval lo b'masmir. You can check with your finger, but you can't check with a nail. Okay, how would you check with a nail, and why can't you check with a nail? The nail check is something different. It's not putting a nail inside the brain and seeing what happens. That would obviously cause a perforation. Okay, so they don't mean that. What they mean is, and we talked about this before, you could run a nail along the edges of the membrane, and gently, right? And as you run it around, if it stops on something, that'll be an indicator that there's a perforation. Right? These perforations are very hard to see. So the best way to do it is to run something around the circumference of it. And if it catches on something, right, something sharp, then catches on something, then you'll know. So don't use that here, though. Why not? Because you can create a perforation by using a nail. Okay, a nail is very sharp. So while it might test whether there's a hole, it also might create a hole. And then you're going to make the animal, people won't know the hole came from that. They'll say, for sure, the animal's a treifa. So that was the limitations. He said, okay, forget the first limitation. That wasn't true. You really can do a check, but it would have to be biyad, like Rav Shmuel and Levi said, but not with a nail. Obviously, somebody thought it could be done with a nail, and in fact, we're going to see who right now. For Rabbi Yochanan Amar, af b'masmir. Rabbi Yochanan says you could do biyad, you could do b'masmeo. Okay, so now we have two different ways to do it, even though Rish Lakish disagrees with the second one. Now they're going to say, Ubeplutze to Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Nechemia. Now the machlok of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish is actually the same machlok as Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Nechemia, although we'll see it's not exactly the same. Okay, because why? Let's just summarize. Rish Lakish says biyad only. Rabbi Yochanan says two possible ways, biyad or b'masmeo. Here we're going to see that there's a machlok between them, biyad or b'masmeo, but it's going to be either or. Nobody thinks you could do both. So it's not exactly parallel, but that doesn't bother the Gemara. They say it's the same machlok, and we're going to see right now. Cha badik biyada, cha badik b'machta. So one says we check with our hand, and one says we check with a needle, which is basically no different than a nail. Man debadik biyada, arma leila, man debadik. Now, first of all, we don't know who says what. Soon we're going to figure out who said what. But, right, we just say Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia disagreed about this. One said this, one said that. And the one who said, now we're going to have a conversation between them. And that's why it's going to be clear each one disagrees with the other completely. Not like Rabbi Yochanan, who said even. The one who checked by hand says you check by hand. Said to the one who checked with a needle, who says you could check with a needle. To what extent are you're basically causing a financial loss to the Jewish people, because every time you check with a needle, you're going to accidentally perforate the krum of the brain membrane, and then you're going to create treifas when they weren't treifas to begin with. So that's not a good plan. Now we're going to see why the one who said with a needle is not going to agree with the one who says by hand. Okay, and that's why it's clear. It's not like Rabbi Yochanan who said even, but not at all by yad. Right? How are you basically allowing the Jewish people to eat nevelot? Because basically the yad check is just not a good one. Now, why is it not a good one? Well, this comes back to what we said before, what the Ari said. Okay, even though we rejected it, but basically saying that when you check, it won't necessarily go through the brain, the hole in the skull, and you won't necessarily see it because the hole in the brain membrane might not be opposite the hole in the skull, and it's not a real proof. You could have a situation where nothing comes out, and yet there was a hole in the brain membrane, and you're basically feeding the Jewish people nevelas. So first the Gemara says, wait a minute, nevelot, v'ashchutehi. This is slaughter. What do you mean? It's not a nevela. What's a nevela? An animal that wasn't slaughtered properly. Ela treifot. Okay, we meant treifa. You're feeding people treifas. This, by the way, makes me sense that the word treifa and nevela were thrown around the same way nowadays, right? We call food non-kosher meat treif. Now, it's not true. It's not treif. It's non-kosher, right? There's non-kosher. There's treifa, which is the animal was going to die within 12 months, but it's a kosher animal that was slaughtered properly. And then we have an nevela where an animal wasn't slaughtered properly. But you see that in those days, they kind of interchanged those words, and nowadays we also interchange those words, right? The word treif means lots of things that, doesn't, you could also call food treif that isn't even meat, right? So it has, it's a term that just people throw around, and that's obviously what they were doing here. Nevela was just a way of saying something not kosher, okay? So we basically have this machloket, and now we understand the machloket. So we had a machloket between. Okay, let's just go through very quickly. Rav Shmuel and Levi said, do the hand trick. Okay, put your hand inside, check if the stuff comes out. Zeri said that doesn't work because of the way their teeth are, and it could be angled in, the way they bite through, and it wouldn't be lined up. Then he said, actually, you can't. But there's another machloket that Rish Lakish actually limits it and says, we're going to basically say that you can't check with a nail, but you can check with your hand. And then we saw that machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish was actually a machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia. And now we're going to figure out which position was held by Rabbi Yehuda, which would then be obvious then which position was held by Rabbi Nechemia. So now we're going to say, Tistaim de Rabbi Yehuda hu debadik biyad. Rabbi Yehuda must be the one who said by hand. De Tanya, because of this braita. And then what we're going to do is, the braita has two statements, and we're going to get off on the second one, okay? Even though the first one is the one for our purposes. So we're going to get off on a bit of a tangent. Right now we're just proving who said what, and that machloket. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Omer B'Shum Rabbi Yehuda. So there you have it. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar quotes Rabbi Yehuda as saying the following, which is going to give us our answer. Bodkim lechulda biyad v'lo b'masmer. Okay, there you see it. You check by hand, not with a nail, and that's how we know that Rabbi Yehuda says by hand. Okay, and then Rabbi Nechemia says by needle or nail. Now, The second line, which is going to be very confusing, says, Nishbar ha'etzem, if the skull is broken, af al pi shaloni kev krum shamoach. Even if the brain membrane is not perforated, it's still a treifa. Okay, now, what does it mean it's a treifa? It means there's no check that's able to be done. If the bone of the skull is broken, you can assume, even without seeing there's a perforation in the brain, you can assume it was perforated, and therefore no check is going to help you. Because no matter what, we're just assuming, nishbar, the skull is broken, it's a treifa. Okay, so the Gemara now says, so first of all, tistanyim. This already, we finished the Breita now. The Breita proves that Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says, biyad, by hand. But the Gemara says, but hagufa kashya. That Breita completely contradicted. The second line contradicted the first. Amar butkim the chulda biyad avalo b'masmer. He said we check for chulda biyad, but not with a masmer. Alma ile b'dikuta. That seems to imply there's a way to check. The hadar tani, then you said nishbar etzem afa pishaloni kev krom shamoch. If the skull bone was broken, even if there's no hole in there's no perforation in the brain membrane, it's a problem. Alma leile b'dikuta. Well then, no test is going to help you if no matter what the skull is broken, it's a problem. So how do they answer this? And that's going to get us up into our next sugya. Seifa atan la'of shamayim. There's two different kinds of birds. There's birds that live in the water, like duck, geese, those kind of birds. And then there's birds that live out of the water. The birds that live in the water, ho'il ve'ein lo klum. It doesn't have a brain membrane. So because they don't have a brain membrane, just breaking the skull of the ducks and the geese and any birds that live in the water is already going to make it a treifa. The Gemara says, what do you mean they don't have a brain membrane? Of course they have a brain membrane. What are we talking about? No, the brain membrane is very, very thin in those kind of birds. Because the brain membrane is very thin, therefore any break in the skull, we assume that there's a break in the brain membrane, and we don't check because no matter what, we're going to say it's a treifa. Okay, so now we learn a new thing, which we weren't really bringing this Breita to learn that, but now we learn that there's a differentiation within birds. So let's just summarize. Right now we have bird, regular bird. We're going to do a check on the brain to see if it's torn. We either do it, some people say by hand, some people say it with a nail or something sharp that we're going to basically go around the circumference and see if it stops anywhere, and that's going to be an indicator there's a hole, or this hand trick, put your hand inside and see if any juices come out of the skull, and that will be an indicator, which we did mention there was a possible problem that if the holes are not opposite in the brain membrane and the skull, that might not be a good check, but others thought it was a good check. Now, because we brought up this bird that's in the water, we're now going to have a whole kind of repetitive discussion from a few different sugyot that basically all say the same thing, so it's kind of straightforward. Amalei Rav Nachman Rav Anan. So Rav Nachman says to Rav Anan, Mar, you said, Shmuel badik biyada umachsher. Okay, that Shmuel said check by hand and it's fine. Huna Chavrin Amar, Rav badik biyada umachsher. And Huna, our friend, said, Rav said also check by hand. This, by the way, matches the beginning of how we started this sugya with Rav and Shmuel and Levi. And Hatane Levi, now didn't Levi say in a Breita, Treifo chamanu chachamim bebeima, kinegdam be'of. Now, we said Rav, Levi, and Shmuel all said check by hand. But now they're quoting a Breita of Levi that doesn't say that. And it seems to contradict Levi and Shmuel. Because what did he say? Now, it's going to be the exact same thing we just saw in this Breita, which is, he just adds one other thing, which is any treifa that it says by the animals, kinegdam be'of, they're parallel in the bird is a problem. Yatir alehen of, but the of has one more up on the animals, one more disqualification. Nishbar ha'etzem, if the skull is broken, alpha pishaloni kev krom shamach, even if there's not a hole in the brain membrane. So how does that all work? So Amarle, he says, which our obvious answer, which we know already, ha'uba of shamayim, hu'il ve'im klum. That's talking about that statement of Levi that Breita brought was, quote, it was all about the birds in the water, not regular birds. And that's how he resolves it. Because it doesn't have a brain membrane. So again, the Gemara is going to say, Ein lo krum sakadatach? What do you mean? It doesn't have a brain membrane. Of course it does. Elahu ilu krumo rach, but because it's soft. Same exact thing we had last time, and we're going to have this one more time, because we're now going to have a story where this is highlighted. A case that happened. Who turned a golta? There was a hen. Dahave be Rav Chana. It was in the house of Rav Chana. Shadra lekameh de Rav Matna. They brought it before Rav Matna, and in fact he saw Nishbar Etzem Veloni Kev Krum Shamoach Havai. It was exactly this case, where the brain membrane was not torn, but the skull had a break in the bone, and he said it was totally fine. Amar Lei, he said to him, V'hatani Levi, but what happened to Levi's Breita? Treifa shemanu chachamim b'beima kenegdam ba'of yater alehem of nishbar etzem afa pishalon kev krom shomach. Right, all the treifas are the same, but the of has one extra one, which is this, and it's a treifa. So how do you say that? Amar Lei, hatam ba'of shamayim hoil ve'en lo klum. Oh, that was in one of the a bird that lives in the water. This was a tarnagolet, doesn't live in the water. Okay? And so again, because he quotes that line again, it doesn't have a brain membrane. We're going to go through that whole thing again. What do you mean it doesn't have a brain membrane? Of course it does. Okay? So 3 sugya. One was a discussion between 2 rabbis, another was a discussion between another 2 rabbis, and then in a third case that happened, we see exactly the same thing that we're going to differentiate. So now we have 2 tracks with birds. We have one track, which is a bird that lives in the water, and for that you don't check. It's immediately a treifa if there's a crack in the skull because the brain membrane is so thin. Regular birds you could check either biyad or with a nail. Now we're going to see a few other types of ways to check an irregular bird. Rav Shizbi, and it's going to be introduced by all sorts of rabbis, and this is what they did. So not just is there an opinion that says this, but this is what their practice was. Rav Shizbi badik b'shimsha. He would bring it out into the sun and just look really carefully and find it, right? This is like nowadays you'd say you'd look under a microscope, right? So they used the sun. That was the best way to see. They didn't have microscopes. Rav Yemer badik b'maya. He did a water check. Okay, there's different opinions what this means. Either he emptied out everything in the brain, and there's a when you take apart the animal, so there's an access way to the brain now. So through that hole you would take out everything, and then you put water in, see if it comes out the other side, and there's a hole somewhere on the other side. Or some people say that you just put water in and then see if when it comes out the other side, it comes out with nerve tissue of the brain. Okay, anyway, some sort of check he would do with water. Rav Acha bar Yaakov badik begila dechitita. Okay, turning now to Amabet, he said he would use, and this we actually saw in the past also, he would use the what do you call it, a wheat, like the chaff of the wheat, okay? And he would use like the stem of a wheat kernel. So there, you think about it, it's kind of like a machad or a nail, but it's not as sharp. So it won't necessarily pierce, but as you go through with that wheat grain, you'll basically, it's like the straw. That's the word I was thinking of, the straw of the wheat. As you go through, it'll stop again if there's a hole. So that's kind of a better test than the machad. So now we added a few more ways of checking, and one last point, and then we're done. Amar of Shizbi, Hane av zedidan ka'of shamayim damyan. So Rav Shizbi said the geese that we have, they're considered birds of the water, okay? Because then you have to know, then any hole in the skull, so it's just defining. Okay, we finished the krum of moach, and now we're moving on to the next section. Nafla le'ol, if it falls in a fire. Now this was the whole thing about turning from red to green. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Yossi ben Yoshua, Shiur Yirul Katan Kishiur Nekuvatan. The first thing we have to talk about is how big a spot needs to be green. So they say it's the same amount that a hole would be a problem. So we saw that in the intestines, right, in the innards, any sort of perforation is a problem. So any small amount of green is a problem, because that means already it got there and it burned through. So man kuvatan b'mashu af yirukatan b'mashu. So just like the innards is a problem with any size of perforation, it's also the same of any size of part that's green. Ba'imine Rav Yosef Bered Rav Yoshua ben Levi mi Rav Yoshua ben Levi. Okay, so now Rav Yosef, the son of Rav Yoshua ben Levi, goes to his father Rav Yoshua ben Levi and says, Holika means from the language of Yarok. If it turned green, kaved. What if the part of the liver that's opposite the intestines turns green? Is that a problem? Because we said the b'nei me'ayim, we didn't say the liver. Amalei treifa, he says it's a treifa. So then the son asks, or maybe the Gemara asks, v'lo yehei ela nitla, but if the liver turned green and is kind of ruined by this fire, who cares? You can live without the liver. Remember, if you take out most of the liver, and this is only a part of the liver, if you take most of the liver, it's fine. So as long as you have a little bit of the liver left, maybe a kazayit, maybe a little bit, we had a machloket about it, but either which way, this is not the majority of the liver. So since you can live without a liver, so who cares if it's green? To which Amar Rava explains, Kevan she'orika kaved keneged b'nei me'ayim, biyadua shenafla la'or v'nechmeru b'nei me'ayim treifa. He says, the fact that the liver is green opposite the intestines, even though the intestines look fine, it's a sign that the intestines are not okay. Because that's an indicator that the green was probably going to get to the intestines soon if the bird had lived, which means that it would have made the bird into a treifa. So it's an indicator rather than it in of itself is a problem. It's an indicator of what happened. Because again, the whole question is, did the damage get internal or not? So this is a sign that the damage was internal. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Havilehu Tarnagolet. So he had a Tarnagolet. Shadra the Kamed Rabbi Lazar Kapar B'Ribi. He sends it to somebody else to check. Amarle Yerukim Havu ve'echshara. So he said they're green and it's fine. Okay, that seems weird. V'hanantnan Yerukim Psulim. Didn't we say green is a problem? So they say Lo Amru Yerukim Psulim Ela bekorkevam belev ubekaved. We're now going to learn the green color is only in certain inner organs of the body. Which ones? The korkevam, which is the gizzard, the heart, and the liver. Okay, but the intestines, for example, maybe not. Okay, Tanya Namihachi. Here's a bright to support that. Be'elu b'nei me'ayim amru. With which internal organs were we talking about? Bekorkevam belevu bekaved. Okay, so the Mishna, when it talks about green, and now we're going to see why. Rabbi Yosef bar Yosef Havaleu Tarnagolet. He had a Tarnagolet. Shadra the Kamed Rabbi Yavau. We sent it to Rabbi Yavau. Amarle Adumim Havu v'tarfa. He said, they're red and they're treifas. Okay, that makes no sense. All we've been talking about is turning green from green to red. Why, if they are red, are they a treifa? V'hanantnan, didn't we say in the Mishnah, Adumim kshirim? Okay, you can see why this was completely confusing, right? People are passing completely opposite to the Mishnah. First it was the Yerukim are fine, and it said Yerukim were psulim, and then the Adumim are totally, right? He said the Adumim are a problem, and he said, but the Mishnah said Adumim are psulim, kshirim. So now we're going to make order of this whole thing. Amarle Adumim shehoriku v'Yerukim shehe'edimu treifa. If they're supposed to be red and they turn green, now this is very obvious and intuitive. If they're supposed to be red and they turn green, it's a problem. If they're supposed to be green and they turn red, it's a problem. In other words, any change from red to green or green to red, it just depends what it is. That's why they said we only say green in certain organs, because other organs start off green, and if they turn red, it's a problem. Okay? Now, I don't know exactly what this green is. I don't know enough about the anatomy of birds to understand what this whole real green is. But it does seem to indicate that there's the organs inside, some are colored one way, some are colored another way, and any change in color is going to be an indicator. Again, this is when we know it was somewhat burned, and we just don't know how much damage was done inside, so the change of color makes the difference. Okay, so now he says, sorry, let me just find my place. Right, so so Amarle, I'm just going back to the Amarle. So Adumim Shuriku, I'm just reading that first line again. Adumim that became green, and Yerukim she'edimu, and green that became red is a problem, treifa. Lo amru adumim kshirim, when the Mishnah said the adumim kshirim, they're fine, ela belev bekorkavanu bekaved, that are supposed to be red. Okay? But anything that's supposed to be green and turns red is a problem. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Chia, Amar Rav Mani, adumim she'oriku. Now we're going to have one last element here about the burning. If there were red ones that turn green, but, okay, which should be a problem, but shlakan, you boil them up in water, v'chazru v'ha'edimu, and after you boil them in water, they turn red again, ksherim, they're fine. My taima, kutra ayobuhu, we assume the smoke got into them and that caused the change in color, but once you get rid of the smoke, in other words, it's something that would have gone away. The change in color was just because of the smoke. As soon as you get it away by boiling it up and you remove the smoke, it doesn't look that color anymore, and that's not an indicator then of a real change in the animal from the burn, from the fire. So basically, if you boil them up, you can then, what they're basically saying is if you have red ones that turn green, and instead of throwing away the bird and saying this is a treifa, first boil them up in water and see what happens. If they turn back to red, then you're okay. Now we're going to go the other direction. We also say, adumim shalohoriku. If you had red parts of the body that didn't turn green, okay, like the liver, the heart that we talked about, or the korkevan, if there were adumim that didn't turn green, ushlakan vehoriku, and then you cook them up and they turned green while cooking, treifa. by cooking, by boiling them up in water, if they now turn green, actually it's an indicator they're a treifa. Now, why didn't they turn green before? My taima, igale bahatayu. Okay, what they were hiding is now revealed. In other words, this time the smoke blocked the green color from appearing, and as soon as you got rid of the smoke, by boiling it up, it now showed what its real color is from the burn, which is now it's green and it's a problem. Now, comes Rav Ashi and says, based on what he just said, that by boiling it up, if it's red and it's still red, right, starts red, it's still red, well, it could turn green when you boil it up. So I'm Rav Ashi. So basically, Rav Ashi says, if you want to eat that, it was burned, you checked it. Until now, we thought if it was originally red and it looks red, it's fine. He comes and says, not enough. You have to go boil it up and see if it turns green. And if it doesn't turn green, you're good. If it does turn green, it's a problem. But here's the key line. Vilohi. The Gemara says this is not the case. And this is a very important principle. They don't just say a principle, and this again teaches you a very important value. We do not always assume that something's wrong. Okay, we don't have to go that far. Basically, right, if it's red, it was red, it looks red, let it go. Don't start saying, well, there's a million ways I could check this, and I can make sure, and I can this, and I can that. You don't have to go that far. Okay, chill out, right? Don't go thinking about every possible possibility that could happen, and that maybe the smoke's blocking and it hasn't changed color. You don't have to live your life that way. And here you see these two different approaches, right? Rav Ashi, it's pretty mainstream, right, said you do have to check. But someone added this note into the Gemara. We don't know who's speaking. That's also the more interesting part, right? Did it happen in a later editing of the Gemara? That we do not need to worry about this because we don't start worrying about reyuta. Reyuta is some reason to say something's wrong. We don't go that crazy. We had a kosher shrita, right? The animal was burned, but we checked. Okay, that's all you need to do. You don't need to go any farther. Okay. Last part for this mission before we get to the next one, but all the kshirim and the oath. Now we have the last part, which is the drasa utrafa bekotel. The animal underwent some trauma. We have to wait and see after 24 hours. And it sounds like after 24 hours, if it's still alive and going, it's fine. But Amar Rabbi Lazar ben Antuginus Mishum Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Yanai Achadzo v'Achadzo tzricha b'dika. Any of these three cases that were brought up, you still have to check the internal organs. Now, normally you have an animal, right? Remember we talked about it. You don't have to check for all these treifas. Check if the backbone is broken or the this or the that. But what you do have to do is, right, the backbone broken meaning and the spinal cord is cut. Because remember, backbone being broken isn't enough. The spinal cord has to be cut. I just didn't want to throw you off there. But you don't have to go checking for everything. You have to check for the common, like the lungs. The lungs we talked about is the very common. You have to check that, but you don't have to check everything else. But if it underwent trauma, even though it got up and walked, and you know that we don't have what we call risuke varim, but you might have some sort of break somewhere else, like a broken bone, that's going to make it a problem. So that has to be checked after you slaughter the animal. So it's not enough to just say, oh, it's completely kosher, like it sounded from the Mishna. Okay, new Mishna. Eluk sherot ba'of. These are the kosher things in a bird. Nikvar gargeret osinistika. You have a hole in the windpipe, which is not a problem, only if it's cut. Or shenistika, where it has a crack, remember, and it doesn't go the whole length. There's a little bit here and a little bit there. Hikata chulda al rasha makom she'eno se'otat treifa. Right? If you bitten in the head by a chulda in a place where it wouldn't have caused the brain to have a hole in it, the brain membrane. Nikeva zefek. Okay, if the crop has a hole in it, that's not a problem. Rebbe Omer afilu nital. He says even if the whole crop is removed, it's not a problem. Yatzu b'nei be'eha v'lo nikvu. If the innards came out, but now what they mean here is the innards came out but were placed back in, v'lo nikvu, and they don't have a hole in them. Okay, as long as they're not perforated, if you just put them back in place, it's fine. Nishtabru gapeha, if its wings, the bones of the wing are broken. Nishtabru ragleha, if its legs are broken. Okay, those are totally fine. Nimritu knafeha, if the feathers on the wings came off. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, im nitzla notzab psula, even if all the feathers on the body came off, right? Sorry, he says if all the feathers on the body came off, it's actually disqualified. That's kind of like gluda, right? The parallel. Gluda is all the hide came off, and the bird, it's all the wings came off. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan. So first we have a Braita, which is going to tell some story that's going to tell us something that's completely unclear. Okay, so Maaseh Rabbi Simai Rabbi Tzadok Shalchula Aber Shana Below. They went to, again, we're hearing what they were doing at the time they had this question or this statement. So they were on their way to decide whether to intercalate a year, add another month in Lod, Vishavtu ba'ono, and they spent Shabbat in Ono. And while they were there, Horu, they taught, meaning they gave a ruling on a tarpachat kerebi bezefek. So they ruled about a womb of a bird, or I guess of a bird, but like Rebbe in a case of a zefek, of the crop. Now, what does it mean? This doesn't make any sense. They ruled in the tarpachat like Rebbe in the zefek. So, ibailu. So they asked the following question. Horuva tarpachat li'isura, ki Rebbe bezefek lehetera. Does it mean they did two rulings? One, it was about a tarpachat, and they said it's forbidden. And the other was like Rebbe, they ruled in a case of a zefek, of a crop, and they said it was permitted. Because remember, Rebbe says it's permitted even if it was removed. O Dilma, or perhaps it means, Horuba tarpachat lehetera, they ruled on the womb to permit, like Rebbe permitted in a zefek case. In other words, Rebbe bezefek was just a catchphrase for saying permitted. Okay? But about ki Rebbe bezefek lo sfira lehu, but maybe they don't hold like Rebbe in the zefek. They were just using him as an example. Just like Rebbe said the zefek case was okay, we're going to say the tarpachat is okay. So we don't really know. Teku. We're left with, we have no idea what they did. Okay? It could be l'chumra there, it could be l'chumra there. We don't even know. Amar Rabba v'itema Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Now we're going to have two situations where the Gemara is going to limit what the Mishnah says. So the Mishnah gives all these hechsherim, right? This is fine, this is fine. Well, Amar Rabba, or maybe Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said this, Gagosh shel zefek nidon kiveshet. The top part of the zefek, which is the part where the veshet, the gullet, goes right into the zefek. That's where the food goes from the veshet into the crop. So the top of it is like a veshet, meaning that any hole, any perforation of any size is a problem. Heicha, which part of it? Rabbi kol shenim tachimo. If you pull the windpipe, the gullet, if you pull it, whichever part of the crop goes with it, like gets pulled with it, that's the problem. Okay? That's where any perforation is going to be a problem. We consider that part just like the veshet. Yatzu b'nei me'eha. We're going to end with this. The innards came out, but you put them back in, it's fine. Now we're going to limit this, qualify this statement. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak lo shanu ela shelo hipech bahem. That's if you didn't put them in the wrong way. Okay? If you put them in exactly as they were when they came out. Aval hipech bahem treifa. But if you flip the direction of them, put them back in the wrong way, it's a treifa. Dichtiv, how do we know this? Because it says in Parshat Ha'azinu, in the poem there, in the Shira, Hu ascha v'yechonenecha. God created you, and vayechonenecha. How do we translate vayechonenecha? Milamed shebara kadosh baruch hu koneniyot ba'adam. God built us with compartments, and everything has its place. She'im ne'apachecha mehem eino yachol lichyot. Anything is switched around, put back incorrectly, it's a problem. You can't survive. So if the animal's innards were put back in an opposite way, the animal's not going to live in. It's a treifa. Well, since we already quoted this pasuk, we're now going to quote a braita with a different explanation of that pasuk. Tanya haya Rabbi Meir Omel, he had a different drasha on this. Hu aschavi yechoneneka is talking about the Jewish people. Kracha dekuleba, it's like a city that everything's in it. Mimenu kohanav, mimenu neviyav, mimenu sarav, mimenu melachav. Okay, they have kohanim, they have prophets, they have officers, and they have kings. Shneamar, mimenu pina, mimenu yated. Okay, this they quote a different pasuk from Zechariah, that this is the cornerstone, this is the yated, it's a peg, but it's something more than that, right? This is what builds, all right, it's everything. It's the part of everybody. Mimenu keshet melchama, the pasuk continues, mimenu yotzei kol noges yachtav, the stake, thank you. So from all these parts, right, that's how the community is built, and every part is important, and everyone does their role. Okay? So that's another pasuk about, right, different way to understand that pasuk. Now we're just going to finish up with this thing of innards coming out. So we were talking about it in animals, now we're going to have a situation where we're talking about in humans. Hahu aramai or roma'a, either which way, a non-Jewish person, he saw a person that fell from the roof to the ground. Pak e krese, his innards came out. V'nafuk mayane, and everything got kind of detached and messed up. Ache libere. So what did this non-Jewish guy do? He brought the son of the guy. Okay, don't get too worried. V'shachte kameh, and he slaughtered him in front of him. B'achuzat einayim, but pretend. Okay, he made it look like he was slaughtering the son in front of this person who fell from the roof. The person, what did you just do? And when he breathed in, what happened? Okay, everything came back in its place. He kind of brought everything back in. Everything went back in. And here we have the first, I don't know when they started with stitches, but chayte l'kreise, and he sewed up his stomach. Okay? And basically he saved this person. So here you see that innards of a person can actually go back to the way they were. And here you see sources for the fact that they used stitches in those days, which I think is fascinating. Although I guess it makes sense. Okay, I just never thought about it, but I'm sure stitches existed a long time ago. Okay, what did we do today? We'll try to summarize really briefly. Elu treifa ba'of. We had the whole list of treifot. From there, we really delved into the brain one and the pecking of this, the attack from this chulda. We said there are all different ways to check in the end, even though when it comes to the water, birds that live in the water, you can't check it all because we assume it's so thin that the membrane must have been punctured if there's a hole in the skull. But if it's not, then we have all these different ways, the main one being this finger trick, but then we talked about the nail, then we talked about the sun, and then we talked about the water trick, and then we had the straw of wheat. Okay? Then we went to the fire, and then we learned that even though the Mishna said it turns green, we learned that some parts turn green and some parts turn red, because green to red, red to green. By the way, some commentators say any change of color could be an indicator, right? And then we said, but maybe if you boil them, it changes back, and whether you have to go so far is to then check it actually for the problematic nature of it. In one direction it would permit, in one direction would say forbid, but we said you don't have to go that far. Then we had the drasau b'kotel, wait 24 hours, but again, the Gemara said, well, you have to also check that maybe something else broke inside the body. And then we went to the eluk sherot. From there we had some ruling that we just didn't really understand, so we'll leave that for the review. We won't review that part, but then we had two limitations to things in the Mishnah, which is the zefek, the crop, which is fine, but not the top part of it, which is right near the veshet. Kind of gets pulled together with the gullet if you were to pull the gullet. And the b'nei me'ayim, they went out, they've come back in, it's fine as long as you put them in the right way. And with that, we finish for today, wishing everyone a good day.